They always said a mother's love could break through anything. Distance, pain, fear. But no one ever told me the price a mother pays when she has to choose between saving her own child and protecting him from the world around her. For years I believed a good mother would never leave her child behind, until the day I, a nurse in the middle of the Korean War, was forced to hand my baby over to strangers, hiding him even from myself. During that war, I learned how to heal wounds that weren't mine, but I never managed to close the one that opened inside me the moment I gave birth in secret. I carried that silence for decades, until the day, already old and gray, a wounded soldier crossed my path again. The man lying in front of me had the same eyes I'd seen for the last time through smoke and blood. The cruel twist of it all is that I spent my entire life caring for strangers, never realizing that the only soldier I truly needed to save was the one I had given life to. Today I'm going to tell the story I've kept buried for far too long, not just to ease my pain, but because I finally understand something too important to keep quiet. Sometimes the deepest kind of love is the one that can never be revealed. And if you've ever hidden a piece of your story out of fear or shame, stay with me till the end. You might realize the things we leave unsaid carry the heaviest truths about who we are. My name is Norma Grace Whitmore. I'm 88 years old, and I live in an old wooden house deep in the hills of Tennessee. The porch creaks like my right knee on cold mornings, and the hammock swings just slow enough to remind me of time. It comes and goes as it pleases. No permission asked. I served as a nurse at a mobile triage station during the Korean War, right near the edge of death. I used to believe I was there to save lives, but now I know. I was there to hide one. Listen, sweetheart. I've stitched wounds with sewing thread, done transfusions with glass bottles, and seen a soldier smile with a hole in his chest. I watched all that without shedding a single tear. But the one thing that made me tremble wasn't the blood or the bullets. It was a cry. Small, fragile. A newborn's cry that pierced through me like no war ever could. So today I want you to sit here with me. Settle where the wind brushes gently and memory sways in the oak leaves. Breathe slow. This isn't just a war story. It's an emotional one, about a nurse, a hidden motherhood, and choices that rip you apart. If you stay until the end, maybe you'll understand why I never spoke. And maybe, just maybe, you'll forgive me. If this story touches something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear what a silent woman carries inside. And if you can, subscribe to this channel. Here we keep alive the voices history tried to forget. It was one of those mornings that didn't matter. The kind that starts with the creak of the hammock and the hiss of an old kettle trying its best to boil water on the wood stove. The sky was still draped in that soft mist Tennessee summers toss over the fields like an aging bridal veil. I wasn't expecting anything or anyone. Just wanted to sip my weak coffee, count the birds on the fence, and breathe in sync with the silence. But the mailman pulled up right out front, and even with that tired smile of someone who's already retired on the inside, he handed me a large, heavy brown envelope, stamped by the United States Army. The name in the return address hit me like a thunderclap, rising straight from the dirt. It wasn't just any name. It belonged to a time I'd buried 6 feet deep under my silence. The envelope was stained with oil, marked by fingerprints that looked like they'd held that paper for months. There was a deep crease, too, the kind that only appears when someone hesitates before folding. I waited 3 days to open it. I left it on the table beside the picture frame with my mother and father, who also died never knowing they had a grandson. The letter was from the Department of Declassified Records. Said they'd come across incomplete documentation from a wounded patient during the Vietnam War, treated by a mobile unit with no formal logs. The odd thing, they said, was that there was a notebook with a woman's name, handwritten dates, and a cross-reference to a triage hospital during the Korean War. My name. Norma Grace Whitmore. A name I never imagined seeing attached to anyone. Least of all there. Least of all like that. You see, some war stories have no gunfire, no medals. Some are written in silence, on folded paper, in a name scribbled during a blood-soaked dawn. When I read that report, my hands shook so badly, the coffee cup fell and shattered on the floor. I stared at the words without truly reading them. It was like the paper whispered more than it said, like each line pulled at a memory buried inside me, and I bled. Inside, I bled. The soldier's name was simple. David. No last name, just a note. Recovered by civilian nurse. Name illegible, evacuated before triage completed. What stopped me cold was the physical description. Eye color, chin shape, blood type, B negative, like mine, like his. It's hard to explain, but a mother knows, even after a lifetime of never holding, never naming, never claiming. You feel it in your skin when something from the past comes back demanding answers. And that letter, that damned letter, it was the past poking at me with both hands. I went back to my wooden wardrobe, pulled out the rusted tin box I've hidden since 1951, when I still wore thick-soled shoes and thought courage meant obedience. Inside the box, along with a frayed blue ribbon and some dry leaves, was a torn piece of paper with a name. David. A name I wrote with fingers dirty from blood and dried milk. That was all I left with him. A name. And a lavender-scented handkerchief I tucked into the blanket before handing him, in silence, to a Japanese woman who never knew my language, but understood my eyes. I had no choice. War takes what it wants, and what's left behind stays broken. I sat on the hammock with those papers in my lap. The cicadas sang just like they did that night I let him go. Back then, no one knew I was pregnant. Nurses weren't allowed to carry babies, especially not from officers who vanished in combat. We were taught to keep it professional, to never mix blood with emotion, to be steel strong and cold, like the scalpel slicing through flesh. But I fell in love. Everyone falls in love during war, with life, with someone, or with a memory that never truly existed. And when I gave birth to my son behind the supply tent, on a night that smelled like gunpowder and placenta, I swore no one would ever know. Not him. Not even me. What hurt the most about that letter wasn't the confirmation, it was the timing. That letter came 60 years too late, and yet it came. Maybe God waited until I was old enough not to run. Or maybe the universe enjoys handing back wounds just when they've healed on the outside, but still throb deep inside. I stayed there until the sky turned dark. The cicadas hushed. Crickets took over the night shift. And I stayed too, holding the name I once wrote with my heart. And that now returned to me like a scar wrapped in the scent of old paper. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or tell someone. But part of me already knew. This was the beginning. The beginning of a war story that still needed to be told. An emotional story, stitched with hidden love, unburied loss, and a nurse who learned to mend skin, but never managed to mend her own heart. And that's how it all began, with a brown envelope, a forgotten name, and a question that still echoes inside me. Did he know? The first time I stepped into that triage post, I realized hell didn't come with flames. It came with a smell that clung to your skin, your hair, got stuck under your nails. A mix of clotted blood, burnt tar, and leather soaked in fear. The canvas tent barely held up against the weight of the sun, and everything inside seemed to sweat with us. The metal stretchers creaked like they were crying in pain every time a body was dropped on them. And the screams. Oh, the screams. They were short, cut in half, like even pain was too ashamed to last too long. I was 22 when I arrived at that part of the Korean peninsula. Still wore the silver bracelet my mother gave me the day I joined the Red Cross infirmary. It tarnished in the first 2 weeks. Ran through the halls of the field hospital like a warning. Silver can't stand the smell of death. And it didn't. I tucked it away in that old tin box, the one that ended up holding more than just keepsakes. At that triage post, time was measured in heartbeats and blood bags. Every time a truck pulled in with a tarp full of bodies, some still warm, others just cold skin and an interrupted story, we stopped being scared little girls and became pieces of a machine. I told myself this every day. You're not a woman, not a daughter, not anything. You're just a pair of hands that hasn't started shaking yet. That was how I kept going, repeating that line like a crooked prayer. The post was set up in a clearing hidden between hills. The ground was dark, damp, crawling with ants that never stopped, like us. The green tents lined up like frozen soldiers, their ropes pulled tight against rusted stakes. Inside there were no walls, no shame, no time. Just a constant flow of bodies, whispered orders, and eyes searching for a sky without ever looking up. War does that. It teaches you to search for peace in places with no ceiling. I remember my first shift like it just happened. A 17-year-old kid was carried in by another. His legs looked like rags, and there was an open hole in the left side of his face, like the world had tried to rip out his identity by the jaw. He looked at me, with the one eye he still had, and he smiled. That smile shattered me into more pieces than any explosion could. My throat closed, my hands shook, and for the first time I understood that being a nurse in a war wasn't about healing. It was about accepting that not everyone you touch will live long enough to thank you. That's where I met Captain Samuel. He wasn't handsome like the movie heroes. Had deep bags under his eyes, fingers always stained with black ink, and a beard that never seemed finished. But he had something no one else carried around there. He listened, not with ears, with his whole body. It was like every time one of us took a deep breath to hold back tears, he noticed. Never said anything. Just placed a hand on a shoulder or left a canteen next to the stretcher. He had that way of taking care without crossing lines. The first time our hands touched was by accident, passing a syringe to each other. But in that brief touch, I felt a warmth no battlefield fever could explain. We started working side by side. We operated together when there weren't enough surgeons. Closed wounds, swapped out bandages, improvised tools. And in every move he made, there was something that pulled me back to life. Like he was the only reminder in that entire field that I was still human. With him, I laughed. Sometimes quietly when no one was looking. Sometimes just inside, when he gave me that look of a man who'd already seen the end of the world, and chose to stay anyway. It was on an August night when a storm broke over the hill that everything changed. The thunder drowned out the bombs, the wind tore the tents apart, and the wounded screamed for mothers they might never see again. And in that chaos, Samuel and I took shelter behind the supply truck, trying to save a shipment of plasma that nearly flew off the cliff. Once we managed, I collapsed onto the ground, soaked, breathless, knees scraped raw. And he knelt in front of me, took off his cap, pressed his forehead to mine, and said just 3 words. "You still feel." That broke me, because yes, I still felt. Even after all those bodies, even after scrubbing away so much blood my hands felt like crumpled paper. Even after burying laughter, memories, whole days. I still felt. And that night, under the torn canvas, I cried on the shoulder of a man at war. Cried like someone confessing. And after that, everything changed. It didn't last. War never lets it. But it lasted just long enough for a body to remember it could still love, still carry life, a life that would be born months later, in another tent, with the smell of ether and hot iron in the air. But that part, I'm not ready to tell. Because in that triage post, before anything else, the secret was born. A secret war planted deep inside me. And no one, absolutely no one, ever came to harvest. There was a tent at the far end of the camp that no one used at night. It faced east, where the sun rose weak and the wind carried the scent of burnt rice and stale gunpowder. The canvas was worn, stained with what looked like ghost-drawn maps. But that was where I'd go when I couldn't take it anymore, when my hands still trembled even after the stretcher was empty, when my chest hurt from holding in a scream that wasn't mine. That tent had no medical purpose. It was where they kept rags, damp cotton boxes, and where rats came and went like they owned the place. And still, that's where time stopped existing for me. I don't know exactly when that tent became my refuge. I just know it started with silence. And silence was rare in that place. Everything made noise. The radio crackling Morse code, boots sinking in mud, the disguised sobs of wounded boys, even the stifled cries of nurses when someone died with their mother's name on their lips. But in that frayed canvas, the world held its breath. That's why I brought Samuel there the first time. He showed up with a wound on his arm that wouldn't close. Nothing major, but it was getting infected. I had him sit on a pile of blankets, cleaned him slow, no rush, my eyes more on his face than the cut. And in that moment it felt like the war forgot we existed. I remember the smell of alcohol, the sound of the wind slicing through the side of the tent, and the way he looked at me, as if he was seeing me for the very first time. "You're broken too, aren't you?" he said. I didn't answer, just kept dressing the wound like it was on my own arm. That's when I realized we weren't touching out of necessity. That gesture, it meant something else. It was a way of saying, "I see you," when no one else did. That tent became our shelter. It's where he'd leave a canteen of coffee wrapped in a handkerchief, just for me. Where I'd stash unsent letters, scribbled on inventory forms. Sometimes we'd sit there without saying a single word. Other times we'd laugh at nonsense like the time a rat stole a bandage and dragged it through camp like a war flag. But there were days when all we did was stare at the ground, remembering faces that weren't coming back. Everything happened there, under that dirty canvas veil, between gauze boxes and the muffled whisper of the world. Samuel held me like something fragile that still had a chance of being fixed, and I let him. Me, who until then only offered steady hands and sharp commands. Me, who hid my chest beneath a white uniform like being a woman in a war zone was a sin. That night, he undressed me like he was peeling away armor, not clothes, and I didn't cry. For the first time in a long time, I didn't cry. I just breathed him in like his scent was the only safe place I had left. War has this strange power. It speeds everything up, turns seconds into memories, turns gestures into promises, turns a glance into a home. In peacetime, maybe I'd never have loved him like that. But there I loved him like he was my last breath, like the whole war was waiting just outside the tent flap. It didn't last. We knew it wouldn't. The next morning he was called out on an urgent retreat, looked at me with those sunken eyes, said, "Wait for me here, Roy," and ran like he still had time. He never came back. They said the truck was ambushed, that there were no bodies left, no uniforms. But I never believed it. Never really mourned either. Some part of me still thought he'd return, that he'd pull open the tent flap and ask if the coffee was hot. But instead of him, what came was the nausea. Days later, I threw up behind the water barrel, and I knew. It was like my body had held on to that moment the way you tuck a seed into the ground before winter. And now, it was sprouting. A life born between rags, between flying bullets, between pieces of us that could never be glued back together. In that tent, I cried alone, clutching my belly, asking God if a child could grow among open wounds. I kept working, smiling with just one corner of my mouth, hiding the bump under looser aprons. No one noticed. Or maybe they all pretended not to see. Nurses learned to hide everything, even hope. Over the next months, that tent became my whole world. It's where I talked to him, the baby, before he was even born. I apologized, told stories, promised love in silence. And I wrote letters, one each week. Letters I never sent. Letters I still keep in that tin box. Words scribbled between triages, with trembling fingers stained in strangers' blood. Son, if you ever find out who I was, please forgive me for staying silent. It was in that tent that time came undone. Because there, the past and future had no shape. Only the present hurt. It's where I was just Norma. Not a sergeant, not a nurse, not a cog in the war machine. Just a pregnant woman in a war zone, holding tight to a secret the world could never know. And when he was born, well, that happened somewhere else. But I swear, it was in that tent that I first heard his cry. Even without being there. It was like the canvas held the sound, like every fold carried the echo of what was never allowed to be spoken. Even now, when the wind hits just right, I hear it. I hear the fabric breathe. And I remember. I remember the only time I wasn't afraid inside the war. The day they took my son from me was the same day the train screamed like a wounded animal and headed north, crossing the fog-covered valley like it was running from itself. It was still early, the kind of morning when the sky can't decide if it wants to be day or keep being night. I remember the screech of metal dragging along the tracks, the smell of burnt oil, and the feeling that something inside me was being pulled away with those rail cars, even though I never boarded. The night before, I got a direct order. Immediate evacuation. The mobile base was being shut down for safety, and nurses were being reassigned. I begged to stay, pleaded, said I could still be useful, that there was more to do. But it didn't matter. War doesn't hear personal requests. War answers to stamped papers. And my name was there, on the clipboard held by the substitute captain, pointing me to a destination I didn't choose. I looked at that piece of paper the way someone looks at a sentence. Not for my departure, but for everything it would mean. It had been just over 2 weeks since I'd given birth. Alone, in an improvised room with yellowed cloths hanging from the ceiling, and a bucket of warm water that cooled too fast. It happened fast and quiet, like everything else in those days. I cut the cord myself. Didn't cry. Didn't sing. I just held him in my arms with the firmness only fear can give. His eyes were closed, his skin red like a fragile autumn leaf. He was a boy, and I'd known his name before he was even born. David. A simple, strong name, one that could fit into any country, any sorrow. I hid him for 7 days. Wrapped cloths around my body and pretended I was tending to a comatose soldier who couldn't be disturbed. I slept with him in a hidden corner of the supply tent, near a wall full of holes where the wind passed through like a holy breath. When I had to return to the infirmary, I asked the Korean cook for help, a woman with a deep-lined face and thick silence, who kept him wrapped in blankets between rice baskets and flour sacks. She never asked anything. Just said, "He smells like heaven. and that was enough. But when the order came to board, everything inside me collapsed. I knew I couldn't take him. There was no permission, no destination, no way to hide a newborn among syringes and suture kits. And more than that, I knew what that train carried. Mutilated soldiers, bagged blood, crates of morphine, and hopes that probably wouldn't make it anywhere. A baby wouldn't survive. Not there. Not with me. Not in that world where even a cry was reason enough for punishment. I spent the night writing. A letter to him. A note for whoever might find him. One last plea to God. I placed everything in a little metal box, along with a piece of his blanket, the bracelet my mother gave me in my youth, and a folded handkerchief dabbed with my perfume, holding on to the ridiculous hope that maybe one day he'd catch the scent and remember me, even if he never got to see me as his mother. The next morning, I handed my son over to a Japanese woman who worked with refugees. She had a calm face and hands that had held too many losses. I didn't say much, almost nothing, just whispered, "Take care of him," and touched my chest with an open hand. She understood, and she took him. His name was stitched onto a piece of gauze with blue sewing thread. That's how he left. No documents, no past, no mother. I returned to the triage tent like someone walking back from a funeral with no grave. My uniform was clean, my face composed, and no one noticed the hollow inside me. No one ever does. War is an expert at making everything look normal. When the truck dropped me at the station where the train waited, I wasn't myself anymore. I was just the shell of a story no one would ever hear. I remember the sky was white, like even God had run out of color that day. I sat near a cracked window. The tracks groaned like old bones. Each jolt of the train felt like the world telling me, "You left him behind." But I didn't cry. Not that day. The pain was too deep to come out through tears. It settled low in my stomach and stayed there, like a smooth stone time couldn't wear down. The train never came back. At least, not for me. I never heard a word about it, or the woman, or David. Never knew if he was adopted, if he stayed in the war zone, if he made it through his first winter. I spent the years after making up futures for him. In every child I saw running, I searched for the shape of his ears. In every teenager with a backpack and a notebook, I looked for hints of someone who might have been mine. But he never appeared. I kept everything. The box, the memory, the name. Locked it all inside me like someone sealing a vault with no key. They told me I was a good nurse, that I saved many, that I was a hero. But no one ever knew that while I wrapped bandages around soldiers, a piece of me was bleeding non-stop. Because there are wounds no stitch can close. And there are war stories that never get medals, only silence. It was that same silence that stayed with me until the day of the letter. The one that came too late, smelling of dust and frozen memories. And right there, holding those shaking pages, I finally understood. Maybe that train left, but it didn't take everything. Something had come back, something asking to be faced. Maybe it wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of what I never had the courage to say. I came back from the war with harder hands and a softer heart than I ever thought possible. My skin carried the mark of foreign sun. My back held the stiffness of silent morning, and my hands had gained a precision that didn't ask permission. It was like the years spent tending open wounds had trained my fingers to move just right, at just the right time. And that's how I kept living, caring for other men, day after day, never once mentioning the only one who was truly mine. I took a position at a veterans' hospital in rural Missouri, a gray, damp place where the halls smelled like stale mint and stainless steel. The patients came and went like slow waves, some missing limbs, others with shredded memories. Some stared at the ceiling like they were searching for a sky that no longer existed. And some cried at night, softly, like lost boys who never made it home. Most were younger than my son would have been if he had made it. And in some strange way, each one of them reminded me of him, even though I'd never seen him grow. I touched those men like every gesture was an apology. For not being there, for not telling the truth, for not being a mother, even though I'd given birth. My fingers learned to read pain in silence. I became an expert in the quiet of the wounded. I could tell when a bandage was too tight just by the way an eyelid twitched. I knew when the morphine wasn't enough by how a hand searched for the sheet. And I knew, too, when the soul was more broken than the body. And in those cases, the only thing I could do was pull up a chair and sit quietly with them. No one there knew about me. They didn't know about the baby left between borders, or the name I'd stitched with my soul onto a strip of blue gauze. They didn't know I dreamed of a face I'd never seen grow up. But they all trusted me. They called me Mama Norma, even the ones old enough to be grandfathers. Maybe it was the way I laid a hand on a shoulder, or the way my eyes lingered longer than necessary. Maybe it was the food I snuck into apron pockets, or the letters I read aloud to those who couldn't see anymore. I don't know. But that hospital became my place of penance, and those patients, an endless line of substitute sons. Sometimes I wondered if I was paying off a promise, if this life spent caring for other men, year after year, was my atonement for the absence I left behind. When I stayed up all night next to a dying veteran, holding his hand until the pulse faded, I thought of David. Wondered if somewhere in the world, someone was doing for him what I did for strangers. If there was another woman with hands like mine, who knew how to care without asking, love without a name. There was one patient who marked me more than the others. His name was Richard Boone. He'd been wounded on the front line in Vietnam, carried a bullet near his heart, and had a gaze that didn't seem to trust a soul. He was quiet, cold, guarded like a stray dog. No one could get through to him. But one day he saw one of my handkerchiefs fall. It was an old one, embroidered with lavender. He picked it up, looked at it, and said, "This smells like childhood." That stopped me cold, because lavender was the scent I left with my son, the same one I tied into the blanket in the tin box, the same one that still lingers in my letters even though no one reads them. After that, Richard began to watch me, not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet awe, like something about me felt familiar. I started sitting with him at meals, treated his wounds with more care, listened to his silences with more reverence, and deep down, I began to feed an impossible hope. That maybe he was. Maybe life, full of its twists and whims, had brought him back to me. But it was just an illusion. The last name, the records, everything said no. He was just another man who wasn't my son, but who received my care as if he were. And yet, that almost was everything I had. My heart developed a silent ritual. Every time someone new arrived at the hospital, I'd read their files, note the dates, cross-check names. In secret, I looked for clues. Sometimes I stared too long. A lift of an eyebrow, a birthmark, a certain way of wrinkling the nose. And every time I found nothing, I felt a fresh kind of loss, like the David inside me was dying all over again, without a sound. That's how it went for decades. The hands that cared for other men were the same ones that changed invisible diapers, rocked ghosts to sleep, warmed hope with damp cloths. These hands, praised for being steady, were trembling on the inside. Because no matter how much I healed, how many I saved, I never managed to save the only one who came from me. And that's why, even now, at 88 years old, My hands still itch with longing to hold what I never held, to protect what I left behind, to care for a son no one ever knew was mine. It was a cloudy afternoon in March when the past decided to leave a note on my desk. The sky hung heavy, swallowing light without meaning to. The windows of the nursing home creaked at every brush of wind, and the smell of reheated soup drifted down the halls like some kind of nostalgic perfume. I'd been working there for 6 years, ever since retiring from the Veterans Hospital. I stayed not for the paycheck, but because something in me couldn't exist without caring for someone, even when no one seemed to remember that I had once been a war nurse, even when my own bones were tired of holding up old memories. The director's desk had more folders stacked than usual. They were reorganizing residence files for an upcoming inspection. He called me in to help, like he always did when the fine print got too blurry for young eyes. "You see details we miss," he'd say. What he didn't know was that my talent came from a habit of searching through paperwork for something no one else would ever think to look for. His name. I was flipping through the intake form of a new resident, recently transferred from a military hospital in Virginia, when I saw it. The paper was worn, the ink slightly smudged, but the name jumped out at me like someone had whispered it into my ear. David Whitmore. It wasn't his last name. It was mine. And even though David is a common name, and Whitmore could have been a clerical error or a system glitch, something inside me froze. My body stopped, but the world kept moving. I could hear the ticking clock at reception, the TV murmuring low in the background, the shuffling steps of an old woman in loose slippers down the hallway. But inside me, everything went quiet. My hands clutched the folder like it was a child about to slip away. I stood there, still, for minutes I couldn't count, staring at that name like I was looking into a cracked mirror. I opened the file. The birth date didn't match exactly, but there was room for doubt. War records are often a mess, especially when they involve children who crossed borders without names, without certificates, without a story. The file said he'd been found as a baby in an improvised orphanage in Osaka, later brought to an American base and adopted by an Irish-American sergeant. The surname Whitmore had been written down by mistake, an error made by the nurse who filled out the forms. He kept it. I liked how it sounded, he once told a psychologist. That hit me like a blade. I didn't sleep that night. I read that file more than 20 times, looking for anything that could confirm or deny what my heart already knew. The medical report described a man of medium build, light brown eyes, a childhood head injury that left a scar on the side of his scalp, blood type B, negative. Same as mine, same as his. A tiny, irrelevant detail to most people, but to me, it was a breath of hope. The next morning before my shift even started, I went to room 216, where he'd been placed. I knocked with frozen hands. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't even know if I should say anything. The door was slightly ajar, and the lamplight created a soft, shadowy glow. Inside, he was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the garden with eyes that weren't really there. There was something in the curve of his shoulders, in the way he held the teacup with both hands, that made me think of Samuel. That reserved posture, the spine held straight, even in weakness. And for 1 second, just one, I felt the world slow down. It was like my heart recognized what my mind couldn't allow. "May I come in?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He turned slowly, met my gaze and nodded. There was kindness in him, but also distance. The kind of distance carried by those abandoned too early. I started talking about nothing. If he liked the food, if the room was comfortable, if he'd been sleeping well. He answered carefully, with short words, But between each sentence there was a pause, like he was waiting, like he wanted something too. I walked over to the bookshelf and saw something unexpected. A folded handkerchief, embroidered with lavender. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. But the stitching was identical to one I had done in silence decades ago, tucked away in a metal box I never opened. "It's the only thing I had from the orphanage," he said, catching my glance. "Never knew who it belonged to. But the smell always helped me sleep." My body shook. It was impossible. Or it was fate. Or maybe time playing some cruel trick. I sat down across from him, and for long, quiet minutes, I just watched. He had features that could have been mine. A chin like my father's. The same rounded shape of the left ear. Hands long and slender, like mine were before age shrank my fingers. I didn't know if I could ask, if I should. But before I could speak, he smiled. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he asked. And in that moment something shattered, something broke free. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell him everything. But the words didn't come. All I could do was take his hand in mine and squeeze it with the weight of a lifetime of nameless longing. And he didn't pull away. He just stayed there, looking at me with eyes full of questions. Or maybe intuition. That night I walked home with trembling legs. I opened my tin box, spread the old letters across my bed, touched the blanket yellowed by time, caught a faint trace of perfume, still woven into the fibers, and I cried. Cried like I hadn't since the tent, because there was something there, something I still couldn't prove. But that maybe, just maybe, time would. And that's how a new war began. The war of recognition. The war of truth, hiding in smudged ink. The war of a nurse who'd seen so many wounded and now had to find the courage to tell her own son, "I was with you, and you didn't even know. There are things in this world you don't need to hear to understand. A look can say what 1,000 words try to hide. And silence can scream louder than any bomb I ever heard on the field." The first time he really looked at me, I knew. His soul brushed mine without asking. It was subtle. It was quick. But it happened. And from that moment on, everything else in my life felt like a rehearsal for that single encounter. As if all the bandages, the sleepless nights, the bodies I cradled, had all prepared me just to sit in front of that man and not fall apart. In the days that followed, I began visiting him often. I'd bring hot soup, old newspapers, books I'd read so many times I knew what came next. Sometimes I brought nothing, just my tired body and my old war silence, and he always welcomed me the same way, with eyes thirsty to understand something even he couldn't name. We didn't talk much, but the little we said carried weight. We stuck to safe topics: the weather, the trees in the garden, the sound of rain on the tin roof. But beneath every sentence, there was a whisper. The unsaid hovered between us like smoke from a dying fire, warm, lingering, and full of scent. One day he asked if I had children. I froze. The question caught me mid-breath. I could have said no. I could have told a half-truth, the way I had for so long. But for the first time, my voice spoke before my shame could grab the reins. I had one, but no one ever knew. He didn't press, didn't ask why, just lowered his eyes and nodded like someone who understands more than he says, like someone who's known a kind of absence too deep for explanations. That's how it was with him. He had a gift for hearing what I didn't say. And that hurt more than if he had grilled me with questions. Because there, in front of those eyes that looked at me without knowing, I saw myself, maybe for the first time, not as a nurse, not as a war widow, not as a gray-haired lady crocheting on the porch, but as a mother, and that was brutal. I noticed small gestures in him that reminded me of the childhood I once imagined for David. The way he scratched his forehead when thinking, how he folded the corner of a page with his thumb, how he blew on his spoon before tasting soup. Silly things. But to me, they were maps, and each map led me to the same place, a silent confirmation that this man was the boy I left in the world without a proper goodbye. Every time he gave that half-smile, I saw Samuel. That same quick grin, more habit than emotion. And I wondered if, somewhere deep in his soul, that memory still lived. I never found the courage to say it. The words never found their way out. Fear, maybe. Or respect. Or shame. But above all, it was love. A quiet, crooked, unspoken love that preferred silence over the risk of hurting him. Because what I feared wasn't judgment. It was rejection. The chance he'd look at me after the truth was out and feel nothing. Not sense it. Not recognize me. And that risk, I wasn't ready to take. Sometimes I dreamed I told him. In dreams, it was easier. I'd sit next to him, take his hand, and say what needed to be said. "David, I'm your mother." And he'd cry. He'd hug me. Say he always knew. But then I'd wake up with a wet pillow and a chest aching in a way no scalpel could fix. And the day would begin the same, with that same distance between us, filled with small kindnesses and everything we never dared name. One morning I brought him an old photo. It was from the triage tent, back when my hair was tied up and my eyes still full of urgency. He held the picture for a long time, ran his fingers over it like he was trying to remember something. "I think I've seen this woman before," he said. "Where?" I asked, heart caught in my ribs. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe in a dream. Maybe in a place that doesn't exist anymore." I tucked the photo away without another word. But that day, I cried in the staff restroom. Cried quietly, hand over my mouth. The way I used to cry in the war zone when we lost boys too young to die. I started writing to him. Letters I never gave. Letters where I said all the things I couldn't say out loud. Where I told him about the stormy night, the blue blanket, the metal box. Where I confessed I had prayed for him every single day since the train left without us. The letters piled up, hidden inside an old book I left on his bedside table. Maybe one day he'd find them. Or not. But writing was the only way I knew how to survive the weights of that memoryless gaze. He began to get sick. Nothing serious at first. A cough here, a pain there. But I saw the strength drain from him like sand slipping through fingers. A silent panic grew inside me. The dread of losing him a second time. And still staying silent. Each time he coughed, my chest burned. Each time he slept more than he spoke, I sat by his chair and held his hand with the gentleness of someone holding a secret on the verge of slipping out. And then, on one of those gray, late autumn afternoons, he looked at me differently. It wasn't a long look, not even deep. But there was something, a flicker of recognition, as if he saw not just the woman in front of him, but all the women I'd been to get there. "You have mother's hands," he said, and turned back to the window, like he hadn't said anything at all. That day, I didn't need anything else, because sometimes knowing is just that. A single phrase, a pause in a glance, a hand held a little longer. And in that look, even without words, he saw me. Some secrets aren't hidden. They're just folded, like a pocket handkerchief tucked into the back of a drawer, waiting to be found without a fuss. And sometimes they live there for years, whole decades, until someone pulls them out of silence. Not with questions, but with presence, with time, with hands that listen. That's how my secret lived, not in words, but in gestures. in little details that to anyone else looked like just that. Details. But to me, each one was an unsent note, a loose clue from a story that never fit on a page. As days passed, David, yes, I allowed myself to call him that, even if only inside, started to become part of my world in a way that terrified me. I had already lost once. I knew what it felt like. I knew the dry taste of absence, the feeling of looking into a mirror and seeing nothing but regret. But now he was there, close, breathing, speaking softly, sleeping with his head tilted to the left, the same way he had as a baby, even though I had only witnessed that for 7.5 nights. It was like my entire body remembered what my memory tried to forget. One of those quiet afternoons, while he slept with an open book resting on his lap, I let one of my letters fall. Maybe on purpose. Not the longest. Not the saddest. A simple one. Short. A note written in trembling handwriting where I said, "If you knew how much the sound of your name keeps me going, you'd understand what it means to have been your mother without ever being allowed to say it." I folded it carefully and slipped it between the pages of his book, like placing a petal back on the branch. The next day, the note was gone. He didn't mention it. Neither did I. But when he looked at me that morning, something had changed. There was a quiet softness in his eyes, a kind of welcome, as if to say, "I don't need your confession. I have your presence." And that was what kept me whole until the end. One day he was especially quiet. Autumn was settling in strong over the trees, and the leaves danced around the nursing home like cards shuffled by fate. I found him sitting at the edge of the bed, holding an old photo. It was one I'd forgotten in the pocket of my apron. A black and white image of me at 22, back when I still believed war was temporary. "This woman, is that you?" he asked, without lifting his eyes from the picture. I nodded, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. "I've seen her before. When I was a child, I had a dream. She wore an apron in a place that smelled like hot iron, and she held a box." His voice came out low, like it was walking through the room of memory in socks. I didn't reply. I just stepped closer, sat beside him, and rested my shoulder against his, as if that gesture were enough. And it was, because he didn't ask anything else. The following days were full of little rituals. We started having tea together at dusk, no appointment needed. Sometimes he'd wait for me with a cookie already broken in two, half for him, half for me. Sometimes I'd leave a perfumed handkerchief on his nightstand, and he'd tie it around his wrist like a talisman. One afternoon I dropped, this time by accident, the metal box I'd carried with me since 1951. The lid popped open with a hollow sound, and everything spilled out. A piece of the blue blanket, the tarnished silver bracelet, an old button, and the very first letter I wrote to him, back in the tent. He bent down slowly, gathered the items without a word, and handed them to me with steady hands. Instead of asking, he said, "You kept everything." And in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. Reverence, not pity, not sadness, just reverence for a story he now understood without needing to spell it out. And that was when I understood. My secret never needed to be revealed. It just needed to be recognized, not with words, but with love, with listening, with time, with presence. The secret no one knew how to read had been there the whole time, sewn into handkerchiefs, hidden in long glances, in the way I tucked the blanket up to his shoulder like the cold might hurt him more than others, in the way my hand searched for his in the hallway, as if needing the tactile proof that he was still here, still with me, still mine, even if he didn't know. But now he knew. No DNA test was necessary, no records, No documents, no confessionals. He knew, and I knew he knew, and that was enough. Because, darling, some war stories don't need a written ending. They just need a witness. Someone to look at the pain and say, I see you. And in that chair in room 216, beside the bed where a grown man rested the weight of a life without roots, I saw. And I was seen. It wasn't a sudden parting, not violent. It was slow, like the fall of a leaf at the end of autumn, like the fading of a candle burning down to its final breath. David began to retreat little by little, as if he understood that his body could no longer carry what his soul had been holding alone for years. And I, sitting beside him, learned that some goodbyes last longer than the time you actually spend together, and that certain absences begin long before the end. He grew more tired each day. Words came slower, his steps shorter, his eyes deeper. But there were no complaints, no fear. Just a delicate kind of acceptance, almost peaceful, as if every part of his body whispered, I've walked as far as I could. And watching him, I understood that war doesn't end on the battlefield. It keeps living inside men, stitched into their bones, their silences, their invisible pain. One night I sat beside his bed. The room was dim, lit only by a yellow lamp casting soft shadows that seemed to breathe across the walls. He was sleeping, but his face wasn't that of a man resting. It was the face of someone traveling. His brow slightly furrowed, lips parted, right hand clenched in a fist like he was holding something invisible. I gently opened his fingers one by one, like I used to do with soldiers in shock, and in his palm I placed my lavender-scented handkerchief. He didn't wake, but his breathing eased, and I cried, quietly, for the 1,000th time. But that night, I cried without guilt. In the days that followed, I stayed by his side more than I was home. I brought embroidery, tea, books. But above all, I brought presents. Because sometimes that's all that's needed. And he seemed to know. He no longer needed explanations or confirmation. He'd started calling me Grace in lowercase, like someone naming what had become a part of themselves. Sometimes he'd smile and say, You have hands that warm the soul. I'd just smile back. But inside I was already saying goodbye, one gesture at a time. As his body began to fail, the doctor recommended sedation, and I agreed. Not out of surrender, but out of mercy. Men who survive war deserve to fall asleep in peace. They deserve an end without pain. And I wanted the last thing he felt to be comfort, not conflict. So I stayed, holding his now light hand, whispering stories he didn't need to hear. But maybe his soul still did. You were loved, David, I said one night, before you had a name, before you ever opened your eyes. He didn't speak, but his fingers curled gently around mine, as if to tuck that sentence away, in a place no one else could reach. And that moment taught me that love doesn't have to be spoken. It shows itself in care, in repeated gestures, in the loyalty of silence. The morning he passed, the sky was white, not gray, not blue, just white, like the world was suspended between realities. The room smelled of mint and lavender, a strange mix, but it reminded me of something old. I sat by his bed, with no more tears left, just the calm breath of someone who accepts. He exhaled like someone letting go of a secret. No pain, no sound, no rush. He just went. I stayed there for a while. I didn't count the time, didn't call anyone. I just leaned my forehead against his arm and said thank you for the chance to see him grow, even if too late. For the grace of having him near, even if not as a son. For the silent permission he gave me to care for him. No questions, no demands, no wait. And then I stood, smoothed the sheets, closed the window, turned off the light. At the funeral, I kept to the edges. I didn't wear black, didn't sit in the front rows. I stood under a distant tree, in my striped dress, straw hat, and old boots. I watched the ceremony like someone mourning not a body, but a story. Every word spoken by strangers seemed to miss the mark. They talked about him as a veteran, a resident, a citizen. But I knew him differently. I knew him by the name I stitched into gauze, by the fever I broke with cloth soaked in cold water, by the way he slept as a baby, and the way he held his cup with both hands as a man. When the casket was lowered, a leaf drifted from the tree and landed on my chest. I picked it up gently and tucked it into my prayer book, because in that moment I felt life returning to me, just a little, not as revenge, but as comfort. And that was more than I ever asked for. That same day I wrote him one last letter, one that will never be read but needed to be written. I placed it in the tin box, now full, now whole, and I closed it, not with pain, but with gratitude, because some war stories don't end in trenches. They end in a quiet room, where a white-haired woman holds the hand of a man who never called her mother, but looked at her as if he did. And that, my dear, that's what gives meaning to a lifetime of waiting.